Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing the evolution of cellular medicine with Chair, Founder, and CEO of Celularity Incorporated, Dr. Robert Hariri. Learn about the untapped power of placental cells and biomaterials, and how biotech companies are aiming to develop placental-derived allogeneic cell therapies. These novel pathways could ameliorate a multitude of conditions, including cancerous, immunologic, infectious, and degenerative diseases. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dr. Robert Hariri. He is the perfect combination of surgeon and scientist that is needed to push medical advancement to the next level. Dr. Hariri has a proven track record of entrepreneurism, having started multiple successful biomedical companies in the past. His latest company, Celularity, now aims to lead the next evolution in cellular medicine by delivering off-the-shelf allogeneic cellular therapies at exceptional scale, quality, and economics. Cellular medicine clearly has a role in the future of healthcare. From cancer to degenerative diseases, the regenerative and therapeutic qualities of placental-derived cells are undeniable. The question is, how to best harness these powerful properties. It was a true pleasure to speak with Dr. Hariri. As a fellow surgeon, I was inspired by his vision to improve our current medical options. His clinical background, combined with his business sense and unrelenting pursuit of advancement, is unparalleled in the field. The novel therapies discussed in this podcast are undoubtedly the future of healthcare. Question is, how do we maximize their benefit? Listen up as we discuss the evolution of cellular medicine. Check it out. Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Ricardo, it's great to see you, and thanks for inviting me to join you.
Absolutely. Listen, it's great to have you on the podcast as a fellow neurosurgeon, entrepreneur who's started multiple companies. Today, we're going to talk about your company, Celularity, and cellular medicine, which I knew really very little about before I researched for this podcast, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on cellular medicine, what it is, and where it's going. So again, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's start with basic questions for our listeners, because again, I didn't know what it was, but what exactly is cellular medicine?
So, probably about 30, 35 years ago, on the heels of work done in the bone marrow transplant world, scientists and clinicians started to get interested in the concept that stem cells, these unique cells that retain the ability to mature and specialize into any cell type of the body, might be harnessed as a tool to fix stuff that was damaged as a consequence of injury or disease or even just aging. And, as like you, a big part of my life 30 years ago at Cornell was in the management, treatment, and investigation around the mechanisms behind traumatic brain injury. You may remember myself and Jam Gajar at Cornell had a very active laboratory. We were trying to figure out what is it after a traumatic insult that leads to this cascade of events that generally result in irreversible brain injury. We made a lot of inroads in understanding the dynamics of intracranial pressure and controlling the pressure in the head after trauma, the cerebrovascular dysfunction. But what really struck me was that the part of the brain that was damaged, we assumed was irreparable. But there was this hint that maybe if we could harness the power of living stem cells, you might be able to turn back on some of the developmental processes that are generally seen in the repair of other tissues, but we didn't see it happening in the brain. And so I said, well, wow, stem cells and the technologies that are evolving around stem cells, could this be turned into a therapeutic platform? And if so, could it be used by guys like you and me treating these devastated patients? At the time, though, you remember, all of the work was being done around stem cells recovered from embryos or from discarded fetal materials from an abortion. And you remember the controversy and the debate. We were facing an onslaught of criticism about the perverted incentive that might exist if you could only get stem cells by destroying an embryo, or if you could only get stem cells from an abortion. Now, from my point of view, remembering my embryology from our medical school days, it dawned on me that if every cell eventually is derived from that first totipotent stem cell that's created at fertilization, egg and sperm fertilization, and from that single cell, we create every cell that eventually makes up the fetus, the newborn, and resides in that newborn throughout their lifetime to provide a reservoir of cells which remodel and renovate us during our lifetime. Is it possible that one of the places you might be able to find them is in the placenta itself, which we get rid of, we dispose of after a full-term healthy pregnancy? So, and I give my oldest daughter credit for this. So picture this, Ricardo. I was a resident in the surgical ICU. I ran downstairs to look at the first trimester ultrasound, and my wife's there, and I'm looking at the ultrasound on the screen, and it dawned on me for the first time, although my daughter was a peanut-sized embryo, the placenta was already a big organ. And I said, in medical school, remember, we were kind of taught the placenta is a vascular interface between the maternal system and the fetal system. And as an engineer from my original training, I said to myself, if it was just an interface, they would grow at the same rate. The placenta wouldn't outpace the growth of the developing embryo. And so that suggested to me that it played a role in governing the process of embryo and fetogenesis. And if that's the case, what might it be doing? So I put stem cells that I was learning about together with this biology of the placenta and said, maybe the placenta plays a broader role. So I started literally stealing placentas from the L&D suites, bringing them to my laboratory and taking them apart. And the placenta, it dawned on me, the placenta isn't an interface, it's a bioreactor. And it turns out that by dissecting placentas and figuring out what the cellular components of the organ were, I discovered that it's basically a stem cell factory. And as you know, the placenta is connected to the developing fetus by that coaxial cable umbilical cord with blood flowing back and forth. It just suggested to me that placentas are propagated in that organ, differentiate to some extent, traffic into the developing fetus, and participate in creating the baby. And so my partner, Peter Diamandis, and I, we often joke that the placenta is nature's 3D printer that prints the baby. That's how it all
It's kind of true. That's a crazy story. And I think going from clinical neurosurgeon into an entrepreneur, the impetus to really start Celularity for these stem cells that you've spoken about that have so much potential. Tell us a little bit about Celularity's mission. What is the company's overall guiding mission?
So, like you, I've always been sort of thinking well beyond just the clinical field of neurosurgery. In fact, I started my first company as a medical student. It was a surgical instrument company that I was able to sell to a larger surgical instrument company. Then one of my fellow faculty neurosurgeons, Jan Gajar, and I started a company making devices for neurosurgery, which J&J fortunately helped build. And then Celularity is a successor to a company that I started when I decided that for stem cells to have a meaningful place in medicine, someone is going to have to pharmaceuticalize them. Someone's going to have to turn these into living medicines. And that meant you had to understand the industrialization process of turning cells into therapeutic deliverable tools, which look and feel like pharmaceuticals, meeting a very high quality standard, but that someone's going to have to do it to scale, quality, and economics like the pharmaceutical industry. The problem was at the time, if all we relied on was embryonic or fetal material, the sheer effort that's necessary to create the number of cells you need to use therapeutically was daunting, expensive, daunting, and then I was also very concerned about the quality issues. And I'll give you this one observation. So you can get the early work in embryonic stem cells. You can get a stem cell from a very early developmental blastocyst, which is a very early stage of development. The problem is that and I know only 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 fertilized eggs ever makes it all the way through to creating a healthy baby, right? Most of them spontaneously dissolute. I was curious as to why. And so when I looked at embryonic stem cell lines, you know what I found? I found that even though they had stem populations at that early stage, the quality of them was really defective. They actually have a very high rate of chromosomal abnormalities. That's why most early pregnancies spontaneously dissolute in that early first trimester. That's the late period, that's the early miscarriage, etc. So that suggested to me that why not take advantage of nature's quality control process, which is you go through the whole process of gestation, generate a healthy newborn. That healthy newborn comes out and it was good enough to get to that point. And if that was the case, and the placenta is going to be expelled after the baby is born, why not harvest those placentas and use them as a source of stem cells? So lo and behold, that was breakthrough number one. Just the fact that the placenta is an abundant natural resource and easily accessible with no risk to the donor, the child, or the mother. Here's the other cool thing. We learned that the placenta is nature's universal donor tissue. Now Ricardo, think about this, right? The placenta is made up of 50% of the DNA of mom and 50% of the DNA of dad, which means it's an imperfect match for mom. Yet she carries it for 9 months without any immunologic conflict. And it's a bidirectional tolerance, right? Mom tolerates the fetus tolerates mom. Consider that in surrogate pregnancy, mom's not even related to the fetus, yet she carries it for 9 months and there's no immunologic conflict. That to me suggested that this is a perfect source of cells for what cell therapy had to become, which is one size fits all. Otherwise, if we had to match every stem cell donor to every recipient, it's going to go the way of organ transplantation, right? We know it works, but we can only deploy it in a fraction of the opportunities. So that observation that the placenta is useful as a source of one-size-fits-all cells was another big breakthrough. And then there have been many more since the company was founded. I founded it providing the service of banking cord blood stem cells for hematopoietic transplantation, for bone marrow transplants, and then built a research team where we began to figure out how to isolate different cell types from the leftovers of the placenta and use them to produce literally any cell type you'd want. So all these things were the genesis for the company, which was called LifeBank. And LifeBank was a service provider that, under full informed consent, ethically and legally, got our hands on the placentas that were thrown away and used them as a source of cells. And then, you'll appreciate this, an observation that I made during my days in the operating room was that the placenta is also a great source of biomaterials. So what does the dura mater look like? It looks like the amniotic membrane, right? So I remember a day when we were treating a traumatic brain injury patient, actually a gunshot wound, where there was a huge defect in the dura mater. And it dawned on me, standing in the operating room, it dawned on me that the dura mater could potentially be replaced by the amniotic membrane if I could figure out a way to turn it into an appliance for use in the operating room. So that gave rise to the other elements of our business, which is that we take apart the placenta, use the biomaterials to create these unique products for wound healing, orthopedics, etc. And we also isolate the cells for the cell therapy field.
So give us a couple of examples of the products that your company is most interested in producing and the medical conditions that you think that Celularity is going to target highly.
So Celularity has to be thought of as a company that is in the cellular and regenerative medicine industry. Now, those are broad industries, right? Cell therapy is everything from using blood stem cells to make new bone marrow, or using stem cells to regenerate liver tissue or heart tissue or whatnot. And there are many programs advancing the application of cells in that regard. But Celularity figured out a way to create an assembly line where placentas come in as a raw material, like crude oil. And from the crude oil, we take the tissues and turn those into, for example, biological fabrics that can be used to replace skin, replace dura mater, replace uh, fill in defects in wounds, be used to wrap tendons after surgical repair. We also particulate, we take the whole organ of the placenta, remove the cells, and then break down the extracellular matrix proteins into their building block parts, these little 50 micron, 20 micron particles. And then this can then be suspended in any vehicle and delivered into any defect in the body as a tissue repair template material. So from the placenta, we create a whole range of fabrics, sheet products. Biovance is the first one we developed, and that's a single layer of decellularized amniotic membrane that we manufacture. I'd love to show you some. Hopefully, you'll get a chance to come visit and see. This looks like a piece of cellophane because it's dehydrated, it's sterilized, and it's packaged. It's got a long shelf life. Once I rehydrate it, it looks like a piece of skin. And then that can be laid into a defect like a non-healing diabetic foot ulcer, and it will actually serve as a repair template and allow cells from the patient to stick to it, establish relationships, physical relationships together, and then literally pull the wound closed. So it's a really useful, versatile product, very, very popular in treating non-healing wounds. But the future is to treat everything where you've got a need to replace a platform for the patient's cells to conduct their repair process.
How fascinating. I mean, just amazing what those placental cells can do and the fact that you guys have harnessed it. People hear stem cells and like you said earlier in the interview, just sets off red flags, the ethical dilemmas behind stem cells. But you were very clear to say that this is not embryos, this is not fetus, these are placentas.
Right.
Are there any ethical dilemmas that you've encountered with use of placental cells?
So, Ricardo, that's a great question because, personally, I've always been very sensitive to individuals' perception of how technology impacts their lives, right? You can't force feed people to accept something that is against their fundamental beliefs, faith, etc. And so I was always troubled early on that embryonic and fetal sources of stem cells would potentially kill the field because let's face it, half the population just finds it unacceptable to destroy a human life even after conception. So that was a big issue for me. In complete contrast, right? Complete contrast, the placenta is considered waste material. It is expelled after a full-term healthy pregnancy, and it incinerated by most healthcare systems. When a baby is born, that placenta winds up in a red biohazard waste bag, and the hospital pays to dispose of it, right? So no one ever objects to using the placenta. It's almost like a green technology, right? We're harnessing what is biological garbage and turning it into useful tools to treat patients. And by the way, we have been endorsed and we have received accolades for years because of our discovery. In fact, the Vatican themselves celebrate the discovery of placenta as a source of stem cells as one of the great breakthroughs that they now believe cell therapy does in fact belong in society. In fact, I was given a medal by the Vatican, by the Pope, for doing that. So I've never in 25 years of doing this, I've never had anybody come to me and say, you know what, we completely object to using the placenta after birth. No one has ever done that. And in fact, most families altruistically, philanthropically donate the placenta for these uses.
Yeah, I mean you're basically harvesting stem cells without all the drama that surrounds the fetuses and the embryos. And so obviously kudos to you for harnessing that without all the dilemmas that come with the other sources. But how difficult has the FDA been in terms of your company progressing through the different phases? How many roadblocks have they put up?
Let's put it this way. 25 years ago, when I first started my journey here, I thought by today, stem cells would be a mainstream part of medicine because of their unique power. And by the way, you and I both know Stem cells are nature's repair kit, right? I mean, everything you do in the operating room, Ricardo, would stay in its surgical form if it didn't repair itself by the invasion of stem cells and the remodeling of the tissue, right? So
Correct.
stem cells are nature's toolkit. I'm disappointed that it's taken so long for cellular medicine to become mainstream. I believe the FDA's got a tough job, okay, no doubt about that. And they're always very concerned about ensuring safety for patients who receive these therapeutics. But I'll tell you personally, I think cell therapy is intrinsically safe. And I really mean that on the basis of 30 years of observing this field. There's been a couple of spectacular cases where they say patients were hurt by stem cells that were, pushed on them for treatments of certain things. There were those very notorious cases in Florida where some patients with macular degeneration had cells injected into their eyes and they went blind. Here's the problem, right? What is macular degeneration? It's a progressive disease that causes blindness. So I never saw the absolute convincing causal evidence that the cell therapy caused the blindness, or did the cell therapy just not work like 50 to 75% of the therapies that are approved anyway? Listen, there are some diseases that are just, they're at this point, we don't have the proper solution to the problem. But cell therapy in general is fundamentally, for 30 years, been shown to be incredibly safe. And by the way, bone marrow transplant, which has revolutionized the care of many diseases, including cancer, bone marrow transplant, when it first began, was done with rudimentary technology, right? I mean, at the very dawn of all this, we didn't know how to handle cells in a manufacturing environment. So these were processed in laboratories and hospitals and delivered to patients without the quality controls and so on. But to the great kudos to the FDA, they've always, and I've always been in complete agreement with their absolute unwavering demand and mandate for quality systems, manufacturing attention to detail, so that these products meet a very high standard. I always called it the pharmaceuticalization of living cells. But here's the really interesting thing. I built the company Celularity and its predecessor at Celgene with complete investment in creating an industrial process where quality, consistency, scalability, and good economics were always at the forefront of our mandate. And so here at Celularity, and I can't wait till you're here and visit, we have one of the highest quality manufacturing environments in the industry. We manufacture to the FDA's recommendations and guidelines on what's called GMP. That's good manufacturing practices. We produce with extreme attention to safety. We screen the donor and the donor's family for health history concerns. We quality control the products during the manufacturing. We have very rigid release specifications. So we pay attention to what the FDA mandates, and I completely agree with that. But I am optimistic that going forward, with all this history of safety, I mean, because there's millions of people who've received some form of cell therapy walking around the planet today without horrible long-term side effects and so on. I'm excited that over the next decade, we're going to see a dramatic increase in the approval of cell therapies and them being used in a broader range of diseases.
I was just going to ask how you ensure quality control, because obviously that's a key element to your company, and you just answered that question. I guess the follow-up question would be, you've been so successful with this company. What has been your biggest challenge thus far with Celularity? I would imagine it's the cost and the scalability, since the technology and the science is so expensive. But you tell me, what has been the biggest challenge so far?
So the biggest challenge in cell therapy is some degree of regulatory uncertainty. There's not a clear roadmap yet for how to get a cell therapy product up across the regulatory finish line. We're beginning to get a little bit more of a sense of what's necessary, and obviously doing randomized controlled trials and generating the data sets is important. I think that the metrics, I got to turn my light back on. I think that the metrics around cell therapy as a treatment option um, have to be looked at with a different lens than the lens we look at to regulate small molecules and biologics. And I'll tell you why. A small molecule, a chemical that modifies a chemical event in the body, you can look at a very, very discrete marker of activity and safety, and it's usually very time limited, and you can create sort of a pharmacokinetic model where you can say it works or it doesn't work. The problem with cell therapy is you can have the exact same cell therapy administered to two different patients with the same diagnosis. The cells will behave differently in the patients based upon the environment. The cell is the ideal biofeedback system effector. What I mean by that is the cell will go into a patient and it will react to the biological environment that it finds itself in order to try and drive that environment back to a state of health. I often say every stem cell, regardless of where you think it came from, adults, bone marrow, blood, adipose tissue, every stem cell thinks it's still in a fetus, which means its job is to build that healthy newborn. And so that's a great, powerful capability. But it means that if I put it in someone who doesn't need to have inflammation controlled, just needs a pro-regenerative stimulation, it's going to behave differently than in a patient who has the exact opposite problem. And so part of the challenge that for the industry has been it's a brand new nascent technology still in the minds of regulators and clinicians. We need to have a little bit more courage, I think, in allowing and maybe this is part of my belief. Maybe we're at a time where for these breakthrough biologic therapies, these cellular therapies, maybe we need to create a new type of approval where and as well as I do, the typical randomized clinical trial program or system you use for getting a drug approved looks at, in some cases, a couple of thousand patients, and you're looking for discrete evidence of meeting a clinical endpoint. And I know, you may get that endpoint in a trial and get an approval. Doesn't mean it's going to behave that way in 100,000 people that's deployed in the real world, right? The real world and clinical trials are different. And so I think we've reached a point where, especially because of the internet and the ability for data to exchange, instantaneously, I think we've reached a point where the regulatory world can say, you know what, on the basis of demonstrated safety and on early demonstration of efficacy, of usefulness, we're going to give provisional approval with the proviso that every patient getting the product serves as an ongoing observable subject where we continually update the data set. Look, with machine learning and AI, I'd rather evaluate 100,000 people who've tried a new therapeutic rather than 1,000 people, right?
Of course, yeah.
And I'd rather be able to do this over the long, protracted time period of the biological activity of the product in the patient. And I often say, and I know those accordion folded package inserts we get with drugs, right? Those the thing comes with every pharmaceutical. You think patients read that stuff? No.
Zero.
Do
Not a single
you
one.
or I? We don't read it either.
No.
You know who reads it? Trial attorneys, right?
Of course.
Right. So why not create the contents of a package insert in a living, usable form on these, so that if I'm on a drug, I can get updated every day on how that drug's behaving in every patient who's receiving it. And I can be given guidance. Hey, we found out that people on this drug who happen to have this go on in their life or happen to be on this nutritional product, they're seeing these effects, right? I mean, remember with drugs that interact with grapefruit juice, right? You don't know that until you have real world experience with it. So I'm hopeful that cell therapy is going to help shape the regulatory mindset so that we don't deprive patients of access to these therapies. I mean, for example, I just got a call yesterday about a patient with ALS who's desperate to find some breakthrough revolutionary therapy. So what we do is we find ways to create either investigator-initiated trials or compassionate use applications. But we could speed this process up if there was some avenue towards provisional observational approvals.
Yeah. And I would say, looking at your background, I think it's great when people go outside of their niche. They don't just do the very traditional route. How do you feel that your clinical background as a neurosurgeon has helped you as an entrepreneur, first of all, and then second of all, in a field like cellular medicine that we're not trained in as neurosurgeons? We don't really have formal exposure to it, and you're doing it at a very high success rate. So how do you feel that your background as a clinical neurosurgeon has impacted your business and success now?
So, first of all, I feel blessed that I got into a field of specialty with guys like you and the brilliant people that I worked with at Cornell and Sloan Kettering and Rockefeller University, because they taught me a lot about approaching things first and foremost as a problem in need of a solution. And by the way, I started my life as an engineer, an aviator. My life began in aviation, and aviation taught me a tremendous amount about, number one, approaching every failure with a root cause analysis, right? So really approaching it, identify the problem, be convinced that the problem is in fact causally related to the issue, and then approaching with how can I prevent this from ever happening again? In medicine, we don't always do that. Aviation is incredibly safe because for literally since the Wright brothers, every time there's been a failure, it's broken down to identify why it occurred, and then immediate measures take place to fix it. Look, the 737 MAX problems, right? That was all related to the control systems that prevent the plane from stalling. The minute they had accidents, they immediately dissected the problem and it took immediate steps to make sure it didn't happen again. And fortunately, that's been the case. In medicine, we often we don't have the luxury of spending that time really seeking the root cause analysis to make sure it doesn't happen again. I think that would help our field quite a bit. But being around, and let's face it, neurosurgeons are clearly, at least we can selfishly say, are clearly the big thinkers, right? Spend a lot of time looking at how to do things better, how to introduce new technologies. I mean, some of the most active proponents of AI in medicine and robotics in medicine have been in the neurosurgical field. But I can tell you that we have a community where we all like to interact and challenge each other with, hey, this is how you fix things. Like my old partner at Cornell, Dr. Jan Gajar, who came up with a really cool way to do ventriculostomy at the bedside, and we spent a lot of time creating little devices for that. That's the kind of innovative spirit that fortunately our colleagues all sort of have.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you definitely hit the nail on the head, where I think that neurosurgeons are a very unique personality, in the sense that no matter who you are, if you're a neurosurgeon, you're clearly driven. It's an incredibly intense type A personality, and those are the people that ultimately change the field and change the world. Last question, because I know you're really busy, but give us your crystal ball view. The next 5 or 10 years, major breakthroughs that you see happening in cellular medicine that are going to change the healthcare system overall.
So I don't want to get political because I know that's a touchy subject, but I'm very optimistic about the next several years, the next 5 years at least, because I think that our country, which has always been a leader in biotechnology, biopharmaceuticals, and so on, but I think we lost our way a little bit because the focus on commercial returns rather than transforming the field with innovation took us a bit astray. We talked about the regulatory environment we have to deal with, and I think that that's an important issue. I'm optimistic that maybe leadership is changing in the world in general, to be very supportive of accepting a certain degree of risk. And nothing, in my opinion, nothing is worse than having a completely risk averse approach to life. There's a buddy of mine, a former Navy F-14 pilot and just a brilliant guy, a guy named Stu Witt, who gives a great talk about risk. And you may know, I've been very fortunate in my life to have as a very dear part of my life Buzz Aldrin, the guy on the first landing on the moon. And these are guys who push the envelope with a complete understanding that in order to advance the field, there is a certain calculable risk you have to be willing to take. I argue that in medicine, we tend to do everything we can to avoid risk, and we don't necessarily always link outcome and risk adjusted outcome to what the advance has created. For example, we treat patients with uncurable malignancies, and we know what the eventual outcome will be. And sometimes we get so caught up in maintaining the kind of the accepted standard of treatment that we don't do exploratory work. And many of these patients, God bless them, are incredibly willing to be participants in something that might move the bar. They're realistic, right? They know what the outcomes are, but they say, if you can do something unconventional and breakthrough and innovative with me, and it helps to advance this for the next patient, they're willing to accept that risk. Bone marrow transplant's a perfect example. The original patients who got it, they never knew what the outcome would be, right? But that willingness to accept risk, I think, is fundamental to us advancing any field, but in particular medicine. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very lucky. I work in an organization where I got a lot of very risk tolerant people. God bless my investors who are obviously very risk tolerant. But look, I'm optimistic. I think having a kind of a new culture in leadership that has been willing to move the bar and accept risk is going to be good for the country and probably good for the world. And I want to see us, stop wasting money on stupid things like wars. Let's focus that investment on changing the course of humanity going forward.
Really well said. Listen, Bob, what a inspirational podcast. Hearing your story, from neurosurgeon to businessman to entrepreneur to all the game-changing ideas you've had now to starting your company Celularity that has really taken off, your vision for the future. I think the take-home message for our listeners would be, think outside the box, be willing to accept some risk. Obviously, don't be stupid, but with, as you said, the only way to advance the field is by taking some risk. And I think people need to understand that. And as neurosurgeons, we all understand that because that's what we do every single day. But kudos to all you've done. Best of luck. I definitely want to visit that company. It looks beautiful and it looks amazing, and all the great work you're doing.
I'm looking forward to it. And when I'm down in Miami, you got to take me out for a drink. All right.
Absolutely. You got it, my friend. All right. You
Great to
have
see
an
you,
awesome
Ricardo.
weekend.
Thank you so much.
Take care, bud.